Welcome to Roots of the CLT, Chapter 2. I'm John Davis, the producer and narrator for this presentation commissioned by the National CLT Network. Having introduced the Community Land Trust in the previous chapter, we're now going to look more closely at the origins and evolution of the model's defining characteristics. The oldest of these are to be found in the model's unique form of tenure, so the best place to start our quick tour of the CLT's history is here. The two-party ownership of land and buildings embodied in the classic CLT was introduced in Chapter 1, but here's another look at the key features. Outside the United States, this notion of treating land differently than what is built on it has been part of many cultural and religious traditions. Land is seen as something to be protected and shared, not hoarded by absentee owners who accumulate, speculate, and profit off natural resources that have been given by God to us all. This ethic found a place in colonial America as well, especially in New England, where every community set aside lands to be used in common. For the native peoples of North America, this whole idea of owning land was ludicrous. Land was a sacred gift to be used and cherished by everyone. There were also thinkers and leaders of our emerging nation who embraced this conception of ownership. Here's a quote from Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, as well as a more radical pamphlet called Agrarian Justice. Abraham Lincoln held similar beliefs about land as a common heritage. The American thinker who took this concept the furthest, treating land and buildings in different ways, was Henry George. The intellectual origins of the CLT begin with George, so we're going to linger here a moment. During his own lifetime, Henry George was one of the best-known public figures in the United States. He wrote dozens of books and pamphlets. He gave hundreds of lectures. He ran twice for mayor of New York City. This guy was so famous that he got his picture on the front of a cigar box, pictured in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. But fame is often fleeting, especially for someone who proposed to change the rules of the great American game. Few people have heard of Henry George today. Nevertheless, most of us are acquainted with his ideas, even if we don't know where they came from. I'll prove it to you. Here's an image I bet most of you will recognize, one of the world's most popular board games. What is the point of Monopoly? How do you win? You grab as much land as you can, push rents as high as they will go, and wait for other players to land on your square and fork over whatever's due. Eventually, some players can't pay their rent, so they are forced to sell more and more of their assets. So who wins? It's the player who has been most successful as a speculator and developer, forcing everyone else into bankruptcy. That's pretty much the way things work in the real world, said Henry George. That's the game we are all forced to play. You shouldn't be too surprised to discover that the game of Monopoly was invented by a follower of Henry George, not to celebrate the joys of land speculation, but to illustrate its evils. Pictured here is the original patent from 1904. Who was Henry George? His is a classic rags to riches success story. Born in Philadelphia, he runs away to sea at 16. He lands in San Francisco, where he finds employment at a local newspaper. He works his way up from printer to reporter to editor, eventually becoming the paper's publisher, and a prosperous man. He is entirely self-educated, someone who encounters a problem, reads everything he can find, and comes up with a solution all his own. The conundrum that vexed George the most was what he called the great enigma. Why is there persistent poverty in the midst of so much wealth? Poverty that endures despite the economic and technological progress that he sees all around him. Reading widely, he stumbles across the work of the English political economist John Stuart Mill. An idea that ignites George's imagination is Mill's concept of the unearned increment, sometimes called the social increment, which declared that most of the appreciating value in land is created by the growth and development of society, not by the labor or investment of individual landowners. This was the electrifying aha moment in George's life. Poverty and progress coexist because of the ownership of land by a small cadre of landowners who capture all appreciation. They privatize value that is created, as Mill had pointed out, mostly by society, putting community-created wealth into their own pockets. Landlords impose, in George's words, an invisible tax on enterprise, feeding off the productivity of others. They were a bane for capitalists and workers alike. So what are we supposed to do about this sorry state of affairs? The solution he proposes in Progress and Poverty, published in 1879, is the single tax. Have government tax away the unearned increment, capturing for society's benefit all the gains that society itself has created. This would allow all other taxes on profits, wages, and buildings to be eliminated. A single tax would do it all. George's book was a bestseller, bringing him worldwide fame and spawning an international single tax movement. George's ideas were spread abroad not only through his published works, but by the presence of George himself. He made 5 trips outside the United States between 1881 and 1890. On his first trip, he landed in Ireland, made an inflammatory speech about land reform, and was thrown in jail. This turned out to be fine publicity for his next stop, which was London. He filled lecture halls. George Bernard Shaw was among those who attended one of George's early talks. He became an instant convert to the single tax crusade. So did a young man named Ebenezer Howard, who was pondering a vexing problem of his own. What's to be done about the dreadful condition of England's cities? In 1898, Howard published a book that was to become a seminal text in the emerging field of city planning. It was later reissued as Garden Cities of Tomorrow. The remedy that Howard proposed for the crowding and chaos of England's grimy cities was an outer ring of garden cities, combining the best features of town and country. Like Henry George, Howard wanted to capture the social increment for public improvement, not private enrichment. Unlike George, his mechanism was not the single tax, but municipal ownership. The garden cities were to be developed on land that was leased from a municipal corporation. Eventually, over 30 garden cities were developed in England. The first 2, founded during Howard's lifetime, were Letchworth and Welwyn. Today, Letchworth has a population of 34,000, Welwyn 43,000. Aside from its worldwide fame in city planning circles as one of the best designed of the garden cities, Welwyn is also famous for being the town where shredded wheat was invented and manufactured. I mention this fun fact not just to help you win at Trivial Pursuit, but to illustrate an essential feature of the garden cities, one with special relevance for CLTs today. They were never about housing alone. Lands of the garden cities were leased out for industry, orchards, offices, and shops, in addition to being used for cottages, co-ops, and other housing. Complete urban economies on leased land. Meanwhile, back in the United States, other followers of Henry George were developing what they called single tax colonies, combining community ownership of the land with individual ownership of the structural improvements. The first of these single tax colonies was established in Fairhope, Alabama in 1894. Today, the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation is still going strong. It has 1,800 leaseholds on 4,000 acres. Its land holdings include all of the downtown and about a third of the remainder of the city. I've added a picture of a local minister whose church is located in Fairhope. The Reverend John Whitfield is currently on the board of the National CLT Network. He is a living link between land leasing, past and present. Another single tax colony was established in Arden, Delaware, near Wilmington. The founders grew up plans for a village of artists and artisans, where newly built cottages would be individually owned, but the land would be held in trust for all. 100 years later, Arden remains a thriving community of about 500 people. A new crop of intentional communities sprang up in the 1930s and 1940s, inspired by yet another follower of Henry George, Ralph Borsodi. It was Borsodi who first described these leased land experiments as land trust. In 1934, at the height of the Great Depression, Borsodi and his family fled New York City to try their hand at homesteading 30 miles to the north. 20 families gradually settled around them, each leasing a 3-acre parcel of land. These rural homesteads surrounded a folk school led by Borsodi, who welcomed a steady stream of visitors who came to learn about small-scale farming and rural self-sufficiency. He named his community the School of Living. In his many books, Borsodi decried land speculation along lines similar to Henry George. He went further than George, however, in saying that land should never be individually owned. Only buildings should be treated as property. Indeed, he was quite vehement in insisting that land should not even be called property. He preferred a term that he had coined, trusteity. Mildred Loomis was Borsodi's most devoted student. She spent 2 years working with him in the New York countryside. When the School of Living later moved to Ohio, she became its director and the editor of its magazine, remaining at the helm until 1985. Largely because of her, the school still exists. Also because of her, a new generation was introduced to Borsodi's ideas in the 1960s. She became celebrated in her own right for her writings about decentralism and for her personal example of living successfully as a self-reliant homesteader for nearly 30 years. Mother Earth News once named her the grandmother of the counterculture, a mantle she wore with pride. During the 1930s, another visionary was mining a similar vein. He was Arthur Morgan, a self-educated engineer who had several careers, first as a builder of large earthen dams, then as the president of Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and then during the Great Depression as one of 3 co-chairmen of the Tennessee Valley Authority. While at TVA, Morgan oversaw the planning and construction of Norris, Tennessee, to house workers who were building TVA's first dam. The land at Norris was owned by TVA and leased out for residential and commercial development. Morgan later created a second settlement on leased land. In 1937, he purchased 1,200 acres in western North Carolina and formed a nonprofit corporation to develop a leased land community he named CeeLo. In addition to houses, farms, and cooperative enterprises, CeeLo developed a boarding school based on Morgan's ideas about progressive education. The writings and experiments of Howard, Borsodi, Loomis, and Morgan inspired many other ventures in community landholding, including a community started by a group of Quakers in 1940 just north of Philadelphia. Bryn Gwylyd still exists, and as you can see from these photos taken by me a few years ago, it is quite prosperous. All the houses pictured here are located on leased land. There is, however, no control over the resale price of the buildings, nor do people from outside the community have a voice in running Bryn Gwylyd. These same features were missing from all of the leased land communities created in the first half of the 20th century. They were land trusts, but they lacked nearly all of the organizational and operational features that define a CLT today. That was true, too, for the ground leasing started on a much larger scale in Israel and Australia during the same period. The Jewish National Fund was founded in 1901 by single-tax Zionists who believed that land should not be individually owned, but held in trust for the entire nation. Eventually, most of the country's agricultural communities, whether kibbutz or moshav, were established on lands leased from the Jewish National Fund. Australia did something similar in creating a special district in which to build the country's new capital. The land beneath Canberra would be owned by the government and leased, not sold, to the owners of any buildings. Sounding just like Henry George, who had visited the country in 1890, Parliament declared that all unearned increments in land value would be retained by the Commonwealth to discourage speculation and defray the public expense of building the nation's capital. To repeat, none of these early experiments in community landholding are what we would call today a community land trust. They got the basic approach to ownership right, but the rest of the CLT package was missing. Essential features that weren't added until the second half of the century. Their story is told in the chapters that follow.